So I think I'm going to continue in many respects on sort of the same line that Norbert was talking about, but look at it a little bit more systemically and talk about how this plays into what we're seeing in the media system right now. If there's anything that you want me to slow down a lot on, please let me know. I sort of put a bunch of stuff in here, but I'm going to try to go relatively quickly through a lot of it. And so, you know, feel free to interrupt me and say, pause, slow down, describe what you're talking about if I do any of it too quickly. So my premise is one that I think undergirds a lot of what we're talking about here, which is that political information is something that is fundamentally central to an effective democracy. Right? You need information to make meaningful political choices, and you can't sort of make or elect the people that you should be electing, make the social decisions that you should be making if you don't have that information as an individual operating in a democratic system. Right? And yet there's tons and tons of work showing that whether the domain is science or whether it's other policy-related things, people don't know a lot of the stuff that we think they should know about politics and about sort of the decisions that they're weighing in on, right? And so in many respects, people are just not particularly informed about a lot of relatively useful things, right? Who the Speaker of the House is, to, you know, whether vaccines can cause autism or whatever else. There's a lot of argument, or was a lot of argument about a decade and a half ago, sort of stating that this might not be too much of a problem in practice. And there were essentially 3 lines of reasoning where we might not need to worry about the fact that people just aren't all that informed on an individual basis. Right? The first line of reasoning is that actually heuristics are good for you. Right? And the idea behind this is, yeah, we all use sort of low information cues as ways to make larger decisions, but those low information cues might be reasonably accurate. A lot of the time, our partisanship does a pretty good job of telling us who we should vote for. And we don't need to think about what everybody's stand on every particular issue is. Democrats and Republicans sort of divide up reasonably neatly in the kinds of ways that we presumably want them to, and the parties tell us a lot about what kinds of policies we might be interested in. The second line of reasoning is that you don't need everybody to be informed all the time. All that you need is a system that can sort of ring a burglar alarm if everybody needs to pay attention to a particular event or a particular moment. Right? And the idea there is that, right, if something really gets out of whack, then people will pay attention to it, they'll have action in line with that, and that action will recover what's going on. Right? So this was referred to by John Zoller as the burglar alarm model for what the media environment needs to do. And the third explanation for why it might not matter all that much is most people can be completely ignorant out there as long as they're sort of distributed randomly throughout society, and there are some people who are responsive to the real messages that are going on. The signal can push us in one direction or another, even if most people are sort of operating on noise. And sort of on a larger level, it's not reasonable for all of us to be truly informed about all the issues that are potentially relevant, right? So this is actually a printout of the Affordable Care Act. I mean, clearly it's a demonstration. They probably did it in some large font size. But the point that it could be that long is, I think, telling. Right? That we can't all be informed about everything that's in every bill that comes before Congress and make a decision on that. That's not a reasonable expectation. And in fact, society would cease to function if we all did that. So then the question sort of becomes, are we okay? And if not, what is it that we should be doing about the situation if things are a problem? And so what I'm going to do in the rest of today's talk is talk a little bit about my work and some other people's work sort of on how citizens actually end up processing political information in practice, right? And then how that interfaces with either the mid-20th century media environment that we used to be in versus the 21st century environment that we're in now, and sort of what we should make of those distinctions. Right? And so first off, how do citizens actually process political information? Well, the sort of model that we keep wanting people to work on is this Bayesian model, and to some extent they clearly do so, right? Where they have some initial view of the world, they bundle on some new piece of information, and they come to a sort of aggregated understanding based on those parts. Right, of course, it's not quite as simple as that in practice. When I show you a picture like this, you don't immediately disbelieve gravity, right? You start trying to come up with various explanations for why these people appear to be on the ceiling, right? And there are explanations that you can come up with that aren't gravity is dead, right? And so functionally what you're doing is you're sort of assessing credibility and other things that weigh on the value of both the original information that you had and the new information that you're adding to that in terms of thinking about where you end up. Right, so what is this? So this Bayesian process sort of falls apart on scale if one of three conditions exists. One, people get a subset of the information that they need, and that subset turns out to be biased, right? Two, people process the information that they receive in ways that give undue weight to certain new information relative to other new information or to the prior relative to the new information. Or when people just sort of completely reject any new information in favor of some alternative goal. Right? Those are the three cases where what you're going to end up with at the end of the updating process is not sort of what you should believe given the evidence that's out there. Right? So we can then ask, okay, well, when is it that people get a biased subset of information? When is it that what people are encountering isn't sort of representative of the informational base out there? And so I want to suggest that if you think about the contemporary media environment, what you've got is sort of a universe of available information that then is in various ways filtered down to what you actually end up receiving. Right? And these filtering processes have the potential to bias the information that you get. So you select into what media sources you're going to encounter or who you're talking to in various ways. The people around you help filter stuff that ends up getting to you. Algorithms play into this process. And there are potentially more filters, but these are the ones that I think are sort of the most relevant and important in thinking about it. Right? Interestingly here, the more information that's available to you, right, the more these filtering processes become critically important. So you might think that, you know, the amount of available information isn't really the relevant thing per se, but actually it becomes highly relevant here. That the more information you have, the more these things have to operate because we don't have the cognitive capacity to deal with everything out there in the environment. Right? And so the implication of this, or at least as many people have discussed it, is this notion of a filter bubble. That essentially what you end up seeing is the stuff that gets through these various filtering processes. Now, whether that's completely homogeneous or not is actually very much being argued about in the research, and there's sort of been an assumption that what you see looks exactly like you. I think we actually are in a problem state regardless of that assumption, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But that notion that what you end up seeing has gone through these filtering processes is important, because it means that what you're seeing is a small and potentially fairly biased subset of the available information. The second problem is if people are weighting that information inappropriately. Right? So this is some research that a graduate student and I've been doing along with Mike Traugott. The graduate student is Ozan Kuru, who is on the market right now for anybody who's looking for great comm doctorates. But here we're looking at perceptions of polls where people are seeing two polls at once. One of them showed Hillary Clinton ahead, and one of them showed Donald Trump ahead. And we asked them, which of these two is more credible? Right? And what you can see is that Republicans consistently found the Trump leading poll more credible than did Democrats. Right? And so as you move across the political spectrum, the perceived relative credibility of the two polls, and this is in a nationally representative sample through the time-sharing experiments in the social sciences, the perceived credibility of those two polls trade off. Right? And so when you are getting two equivalent, in this case, pieces of information that point to different outcomes, people say, I'm going to afford more credibility to the piece of information that confers with my pre-existing beliefs. Here's another study that I've been doing with two graduate students, Hakeem Jefferson and Fabian Neuner, in political science, where we've been looking at people's perceptions of an officer-involved shooting. And in that case, what we've been doing is we've given people a scenario where they evaluate a series of statements about an officer-involved shooting and assign the importance of those various statements. And I've labeled each of these statements as to whether, in general, they seem to suggest that the officer did the right thing or that the victim did the right thing. And what you can see is that blacks and whites are perceiving those statements differently, in that they're assigning differential weight to the statements that seem to support their own side. Now, there are a couple different cognitive models for why this might happen, and a lot of this paper is sort of getting into those cognitive processes. But the implications of this in practice are that you end up with wildly different summary judgments of seemingly factual matters. Right? In this case, people encountered the same information. This was a fictitious scenario. Right? They all read the same statements, and yet blacks thought the officer should be charged, whites didn't. Whites were much more likely to think that, or sorry, this is the data from Ferguson. We have the same thing in this particular, in the new scenario. This was, sorry, shortly after Ferguson, Missouri, where blacks thought Wilson should be charged, whites didn't. Whites thought Brown attacked Wilson, blacks didn't. Whites misperceived that Michael Brown had a weapon, and blacks were much more likely to think that race had a role in the shooting. Right? These are seemingly fairly objective. One could come to a reasonably sort of removed understanding of them. But those perceptions end up differing on racial lines. I like this in particular because it pulls us out of the realm of what's necessarily true and what's not, and reveals, I think, in important ways that what we're dealing with here is perceptual divides, right, without that sort of anchoring to fact. And the ability to anchor to fact, I think, is where we're seeing particular problems in the contemporary environment. When do people systematically reject information? Right, well, here is looking across religiosity for perceptions of whether humans evolved from other species of animals. Right, and it's not really surprising that belief that humans evolved goes down across this. Individuals in this particular study were asked, would you say that humans evolved from earlier species of animals? Prior to that, I'd actually asked them whether they thought most scientists would say that. Right, and in fact, there's a drop-off across religiosity for whether most scientists would say that humans would evolve from earlier species of animals. Right, fewer highly religious people seem to say it than less religious people. But what's interesting there is most of the difference is actually explained by a willingness to disagree with scientists, to say, I know scientists say this, but I don't. Right, so that people are perfectly willing to, to say, in order, they're asked, would most scientists say this? How sure are you about this? How about you, would you say this? How sure are you about this? And people are perfectly willing to give different answers in certain conditions. And they actually give those different answers consistently over time. It's not that they're answering at random. Right? If I give this same set of questions to them in 2 different waves of a study, they do that. On a partisan basis, we see the same thing about humans warming the Earth. Right? Republicans are much more likely to openly disagree with what they know to be the scientific consensus. It's not that they don't recognize that most scientists would say it. It's just that they don't believe it to a large extent. Right? It's a combination of those two, but disbelief of the authority, I think, is important here. The implications of this, I think, are kind of obvious, right? You're able to sort of call it a hoax and to make a compelling case around that. And this is Senator Inhofe's book. So what does this end up doing in the 20th century information environment versus the 21st? Was sort of that larger question that I wanted to get to. Well, the 20th century information environment is sort of epitomized by this view of what the 1960s looked like. Right? So in the 1960s, this is what a newsroom looked like. You'll notice everybody's white. That was indeed the case then. But you had sort of 3 major broadcast outlets. Broadcasting as a process, whether over the airwaves or in newspapers, was to a relatively broad audience. Right? And so, and you also had a legal framework where you had things like the Fairness Doctrine, the Equal Time Rule, public interest standards about what media needed to produce, that meant that media had an interest in a variety of ways in becoming relatively centrist, right? There were relatively few outlets, meaning they're targeting broad and functionally very diverse groups of people. news itself was viewed as a loss leader. There's this great quote from the director of CBS, William Paley, who said, who said to his newsroom at a point that he doesn't need the newsroom to make money. He needs Jack Benny, who was, an actor to make money, right? The news can lose money, that's fine. We just need to be credible on this front, right? And there was also, combined with that, sort of this rise of a professional journalist class throughout the sort of early post-war period, where what happened was journalism as a procedure became standardized, and there were norms that were very closely held to. These mass media outlets had incredible reach. So this is the percentage of homes with televisions, which, as you can see, by the 60s was basically ubiquitous. Newspapers actually were at their largest circulation rates. And this is in raw numbers, not even in per capita numbers, in the mid to late 20th century. And the viewership of the three main news networks, again in raw numbers, was as high as it would ever get. Right? And so you had, in practice, a relatively homogeneous, pretty narrow media environment. Right? There are some serious problems with this kind of a media environment. Right? Everything is in many ways dictated by editors who are uniformly upper middle class white men. Right? The news looked exactly the same no matter what channel you turned it on. They were all behind a desk in a very particular way with that little rectangular image in the back. I mean, you know this model of what news looks like. There was clearly far too much deference to sort of official sources of information. There was that classic moment where Walter Cronkite traveled to Vietnam, and in doing so he realized, oh my God, we're actually losing the war. And it wasn't until that moment happened that we realized it. Now, how we should view a situation like that is, I think, is really interesting in the contemporary era, and we can come back to that in the discussion. But that notion of sort of deferring to official sources of information was a problem, potentially, in that era. And there are also a bunch of cases where journalistic norms can lead us astray, right? With regard to climate change, there was initially this attempt to balance pro and anti-arguments on a political arena, even though really the scientific question is what one should be judging that on. But what's notable here about this information environment is that people largely had a shared corpus of information. That the information that people could access was reasonably uniform, right? And if something was big enough, pretty much everybody ended up seeing it. Further processes like this two-step flow process where people would talk to their friends, which of course still exists, would sort of ensure that anything big enough got passed on to the few people who weren't that engaged with the information directly. And we also had sort of the rise of public polling, where we had this sense of we know what everybody else thinks. And there was a credibility afforded to that, that actually in some of the stuff I've been doing more lately doesn't seem to be there anymore. So what this means is that actually those three models that I showed you, of heuristics, the burglar alarm, and sort of the ability to for sort of the little bit of signal to get through, worked really well because the environment on some aggregate level was relatively uniform. Right? So those processes were less likely to lead people astray, and were actually likely to sort of constrain the system. In practice, if you think about the available information as being relatively narrow, these filtering processes of selective exposure, social filtering, and algorithms don't have that much to do to change the information that you end up seeing. And so what people end up seeing is more closely aligned to the available information, in part because that available information base is narrower, right? And so most of these processes don't apply. And there's actually some decent evidence of absence. When the idea of selective exposure first came out, there just wasn't a lot of evidence that it was happening at scale. And so people kept testing it and not finding that evidence early on. And so Sears and Friedman, who looked at this in 1967, said, in no way can the available evidence be said to support the contention that people generally seek out supportive information and avoid non-supportive information, which is not the conclusion that we're working with today. There was also this notion of agenda setting, which was very much predicated on the fact that sort of the media was a fixed pie, and the more portion of the attention that you pay to one particular thing, the less you pay to something else. Right? And so that was very much the notion was that what people would be talking about would be indexed to this relatively fixed pie of media attention, right? And that idea that it could be a fixed pie was actually in the early studies just assumed, because there was only so much time devoted to news broadcasts and only so much space. So it's perfectly possible, and quite likely, and there are psychological studies documenting, in fact, that people were biased processors of information in the 20th century media model. But the extent to which that biased processing led to sort of major social divergence, I contend was limited by the fact that the information environment itself is actually relatively homogeneous, right, and relatively constrained. And so if there was a message that was important enough, it wouldn't take too long in practice for basically everybody to encounter it. What happens today? What do we get to in the contemporary context? So the 21st century essentially involves doing this, right, where we now have a lot more different potential sources of information that are not necessarily as homogeneous as they were before. We've seen in practice that members of Congress or the elite has divided in a number of substantive ways. So it used to be that the most conservative Democrats were well more conservative than the most liberal Republicans. That is no longer the case. We're now completely split on that front. And the connections are largely within, not across party. The ordinary public has, in the last 2 decades, very much divided, where we see that the median Republican and the median Democrat are much further apart in ideology and in views than they were previously. Whether people understand exactly what ideology is an interesting question, but what does seem increasingly clear is that when you think about the different issues that divided people, there used to be more cross-cutting issues than there are now. And those issues have increasingly lined up, and also lined up with a variety of social identities to push ordinary individuals further apart. And we're in fact physically polarizing, right? So this is 1992, the number of counties that voted 60% or more for one candidate or the other. This is what it looked like in 2016. Right, and so landslide counties have increased because we've actually physically ended up in environments where we are surrounded by more people that look more like us. Further adding on to that, you can target in ways that you couldn't before. Right, so in the previous information environment, if you wanted to do an ad that reached a lot of people, that ad had to be broadly construed. Right? I have a colleague over in political science who's testing right now what people think of messages that are produced, or what non-Hispanic Democrats think of messages that are produced for Hispanic Democrats and broadcast to them. And it turns out that basically if you're mistargeted, right, if you are not Hispanic and you see a message targeted toward Hispanics, even if you're a Democrat, you like that message less, right? Which is not really all that surprising if you think about it. Right? We probably should be doing that. If people are talking to somebody else, not just to us, that's kind of a negative. But in the contemporary environment, it's less and less likely that you're going to encounter that particular ad, right? What were the Russians doing on Facebook? They were trying to target as much as they could to push people apart, but those weren't being seen by a lot of inadvertent audiences. And so this micro-targeting potential increases the extent to which the audience that ends up seeing something is itself reasonably homogeneous. And there's not a big ability to pick up on messages that aren't targeted to you. And you can do this on all sorts of wacky things. This is partisanship versus voter turnout likelihood by beer preferences. So if you drink Coors Light, you are pretty Republican. If you drink a microbrew, you're a high turnout Democrat. And if you drink Corona, you are not a high turnout Democrat. Right? So what are we seeing overall in this environment? Well, we have a lot of different sources of information. The information that you receive largely depends on a combination of your information-seeking habits, on your network of friends, on the expectations that companies have of you. right? There's not really the assumption that we can make anymore about shared knowledge across society, and your social identity, whether that be your partisanship, your race, or whatever else, shapes the set of information you end up seeing, right? These filters now matter. There's a considerable amount of evidence that they do, right? So, you know, I did a study with a former graduate student who's now at South Carolina, where we basically found that the overall amount of information that was being shared on social media in particular was attentive to what kinds of events were going on. So that actually the volume of info out there varied depending on what was happening in the world, right? There's a whole bunch of new work that's come out sort of showing that selective exposure now does matter, even though it didn't before. Not that people are entirely exposing themselves to congenial information, but they're disproportionately doing so. Social filtering is increasingly something that we end up seeing, where what people are doing are they're getting a lot of information through social networking sites is sort of a funny notion. Back in 2009 when I first started looking at social networking site related stuff, people didn't believe that information would be flowing on them at all. That was surprising that anybody could learn anything off of them. And so this is a very quick change. And so what does this mean in practice? Well, in practice, we're sort of seeing an ever smaller portion of the available information, and that portion overlaps less with what others are seeing. So even if you don't necessarily think that information is completely homogeneous that any individual is seeing, the fact that we're seeing different stuff is I'm going to argue, actually fairly concerning, right? Further, you know, fewer sources out there, or a smaller proportion of sources out there, not fewer in number, are maintaining what we think of as those traditional journalistic standards, right? That used to be sort of something you could depend on in the environment. It's not anymore. And so what we get then is an information environment where, you know, we've been talking, or there's a lot of discussion of fake news per se, but fake news is a problematic category. Right, and here's one sort of attempt to define out all the different categories. Well, what's propaganda or clickbait or pseudoscience or whatever else? But a lot of what we're dealing with in sort of fake news isn't something that you can objectively say it's fake. It's speculation. It's trying to get people to read between two lines and get them to make an inference that isn't necessarily correct, stuff like that. And so identifying things as fake or having an arbiter of that is fairly difficult. Right, but you have just a lot more of these different things with varying levels of credibility out there in the environment. And people are processing them in these problematic ways. Right, and so when people act as biased processors in this environment where they're getting sort of a diversity of information and they're trying to work off of those, my contention is that their perceptions are actually sort of bound to diverge. Right? So I'm going to suggest then in sort of the last part, the toward what is to be done, and a bit of the answer I have is unfortunately no to the question that is the title of my talk, which is, are we up to the task? I'm not sure we are. I think we need to help. I think on some level the answer is that we need to sort of build tools to help get people up to the task, but I don't think we are, at least on an individual level, up to it. But I think the two core challenges that we have are we have different bases of information that people are working with and this differential processing of the information that people actually get, right? So, you know, this is the kind of stuff that's been raised as a problem since the beginning of democracy, right? De Tocqueville basically praised the American media system in the beginning in the ability for information outlets to unite people to collective action. Right? That is in many ways what's made the democratic experiment so successful. And I'll give you a second if you want to fully read the thing or you're already partway through, because I'm assuming everyone reads the slides. You know, we get the same kind of sentiment from Obama that if we choose to actively seek out information that challenges our assumptions, that's going to do it. I'm actually not convinced that getting people to encounter information that's different from them is actually the fix. And the reason I don't think it's the fix is because I think there are some core problems with how people encounter that information when they end up doing the sort of weighting processes that I talked about earlier. right? So if we think about what is it that encourages people to do diverse information seeking, I did some work with a graduate student, or now not graduate student anymore, Dam-Hee Kim, on information seeking traits and habits. And so we were looking at whether people thought it was important to seek out diverse information and whether they actually sought out diverse information. This is not a probability sample, but it's a broad national sample of people, the extent to which they said that diversity seeking was important on the x-axis versus the extent to which they said they actually did it. And when we looked at their information seeking behaviors, they were reasonably accurate in whether they said they actually did it. So we took them at their word because it was too much work to come up with a clean measure there. What you can see is that a lot of people do actually do it, which is seemingly fairly nice, right? That there is a correlation between doing it and thinking that it's important. But when we sort of took it a little bit further, and actually I'm realizing I don't think I included that bit. When we took it a little bit further to figure out what it was that was having the effect on sort of good citizenship measures, it was the value, not the trait, or it was related to good citizenship measures. So good citizens, or people who seemed to participate, who had high efficacy, things like that, were very likely to say seeking diverse information was important. But it wasn't the people who sought diverse information that did that stuff. So what does that imply? Well, I think it implies the causality chain's backwards. I think it implies that we've taught good citizens for however many years that they need to go out and seek diverse information, but I think that actually doing so doesn't matter that much. Because what happens is when ordinary people encounter diverse information, they say this stuff isn't credible because it doesn't look like anything that I believe or the people around me believe. Right? And that's a real potential problem. It's also a research question because we haven't really been able to tease out the causality there, and I think we need to. Right? We've been working a little bit more recently on sort of trying to identify what people's information-seeking goals actually are, so what they see as important and what they value. And from the stuff we have right now, there seems to be this sort of divide between valuing in-depth, trustworthy, contextualized, and diverse stuff versus valuing stuff that's viewpoint reinforcing, comfortable, and pretty easy to digest. Right? And so that distinction might be something that we could potentially work on. But if you think about sort of when people actually encounter a piece of information, we all heard the birther story, right? That wasn't something that we didn't encounter. The question really becomes in practice, who ends up believing it, right? And who believes this story? Well, the people that end up believing it are those people that are predisposed to dislike Barack Obama in the first place, right? So you take Republican partisans, conservatives, and people who hold anti-black attitudes. The extent to which those people end up disliking the president essentially explains the extent to which people say, when asked where was Barack Obama born, some answer that's outside the US. We got some really unique answers to that, like they say Hawaii, but I don't believe it. But that is, that is essentially the process that's going on here. So in a case like the birther narrative, pretty much everybody encounters it. It's this belief that ends up being shaped by one's own identity and how well it comports with the other stuff, which is very much in line with what Norbert was saying. Ditto for when we did this officer-involved shooting study and we were trying to understand what it was that seemed to matter for perceptions of officer-involved shootings and whether people thought the officer's actions were appropriate or the officer should be charged. We had very big distinctions on racial grounds. Right? And actually, when we unpacked that, we put in sort of two other variables at the same time, which is whether people held anti-black attitudes on a symbolic racism scale, which is essentially in practice their perceptions of whether blacks violate social norms, and perceptions of police fairness. And those explained the vast majority of it. Right? So it wasn't the identity alone per se, but that in large part, those perceptions that blacks violate social norms or that the police are fair versus unfair ended up driving the way that people processed this consistent information we gave them to end up at a conclusion either that the officer was at fault or that the person was. So I think in the process of sort of moving toward an answer to this, we have to think about political socialization as being at the core of an answer, but I think we do have sort of a real problem, right? So political socialization is the sort of where people get their information habits and norms, and also in many ways what their prior bases of information are, which are the two things that are going to shape this updating that they end up doing to come to a conclusion. And there are four sources that people talk about as the places where political socialization happens, right? So political socialization can sort of happen in the home, it can happen through media, it can happen through school, and it can happen through our physical sort of social environments, right? Ideally, what we need to do is we need to socialize citizens who expose themselves to broad bases of information but can identify quality evidence regardless of where it points, right? And maybe on some level, there's value in sort of thinking about, can we evaluate the quality of a source before we actually see the information from it, right? Because once we see that information, we're already using that information in our evaluation, which is really problematic. But can also recognize, I think, importantly, that others in society can use the same information to come to very different conclusions. And I haven't fully wrestled with this, and this is sort of throwing out pieces of, I think, where an answer goes to try to give a more hopeful end to where we are right now. But I think 3 of the 4 socialization processes, as currently construed, are working against us, right? What's happening in your home is largely that parents are passing on their own biases to their kids. What's happening on the media is that people are increasingly exposed to very different messages and aren't necessarily getting that center that one needs to be able to get everybody mobilized on the same page. And what's happening in our social environments is we're increasingly living in social environments that look a lot like us, and where when we look out, the belief set matches a particular view. And so even if we're hearing a diverse piece of information, what's that diverse piece of information going to do for us? Well, a lot of the time, it's going to be rejected because nobody else seems to believe this, right? And in fact, even if you see a poll that seems like a pretty objective piece of information saying that your belief is in the minority, you distrust the credibility of that information, right, based on presumably the fact that the other people around you don't actually look like that. Although schools can help, I think the way that we've thought about civic education in the past is itself a little bit problematic, right? So the way that we've thought about civic education in the past, this has been the outcome variable, getting people to participate. But participation isn't actually the problem right now, right? The problem is being able to evaluate information accurately, being able to sort of get consistent understandings of things, and being properly critical about the information that one's accessing. And unfortunately, that's not really where we've been targeting things in the past, right? And so if you looked at the prior literature, which I did one piece on sort of a long time ago, really the outcome that mattered was internal efficacy, or the extent to which people thought they could matter to go do something in the first place. And to the extent civic education has been revived, it's been largely targeted toward that. But that may not be the right outcome. Getting participants who are just as biased is actually probably part of the problem. So where do we need to go from here? Well, right now I think this is sort of where we are, where there seem to be a lot of burglar alarms going off, but people functionally aren't really listening to them, or at least aren't listening to them in a consistent way. And so I think, increasingly thinking about media literacy stuff and what that means and how people can encounter information in the right state of mind is critically important. I think information-seeking norms are a part of this, and I don't think that's a part that's been sort of as well explicated as it could be. We talk a lot about what habits people have when they seek out information, but we don't talk a lot about what they think is important when they're seeking information. And those are very different things, right? So I think thinking about how to instill the right values there is a big deal. There's probably a sort of public policy angle that involves what it is that media outlets and online portals need to do. And clearly, Facebook is thinking about it. Things like the Honest Ads Act are moving toward that, but I don't think we know exactly what that looks like at this point. And I think the firewall between news and not really news is a lot weaker than it needs to be. And we need to think about how to be a lot clearer on that. And there are good reasons that there's sort of some opinion mixed into a lot of news articles right now. There were cases where the media sort of got hoodwinked, as it were, on not really evaluating things. But being able to provide that context without slipping into opinion is a really tricky game. And one that I think we need to find some way to push more on. So those are my thoughts on the contemporary state of things. Yeah.
So I'm just going to observe, being a sociologist, that you sounded as pessimistic as a meeting at the American Sociological Association, where we all get together and depress each other for 4 days. But
sorry, I'm trying to get the optimistic note, but I don't have it.
But I want to point out an issue that we know is a problem in sociology. We've been struggling with it for a long time, which is that do these models actually, these models are predicting how everything stays the same and these deterministic processes, but they aren't necessarily all that strong in predicting change.
So the models of what? Sorry.
Your model of how the socialization works.
Yeah.
How do you, how does change then just happen? And I may be jumping the gun here by talking about Virginia, because I don't think we have enough information about what actually happened in terms of voting change. So there does seem to be something going on with women in the United States. And are women paying attention to and listening to a different set of information than men?
So I think the women thing might be really interesting because it's a social cleavage that is not partisan.
Yeah, that is
right?
Really
which is really useful here. Because so many of our social cleavages in the past 30 years have become partisan that there's not much that sort of shifts that right now. So gender is one thing that, there are a lot of female Republicans, right? That's not a surprise to anybody. And to the extent that that is, right, something that's not aligned on partisan lines, we have a shot there. And it's also something, there aren't communities, or there aren't many communities, if there are, that are completely homogenous on a gender basis in the way that we are disturbingly homogenous on most other political bases, right? And so yeah, I think there's good there. I think that's right. I think focusing on the political cleavages that are, or on the cleavages that are not partisan is a good way to go, because it avoids the retrenchment that we're likely to get whenever we focus on a partisan cleavage, right? So I think there is room to maneuver there. I don't know what to make of Virginia per se. Virginia could easily be mostly a turnout difference or a few other things like that. So I don't want to, and I haven't looked at those numbers since then. Yeah, Dave?
Yeah, just a comment, not a question. The comment is it'd be great to have a historian here, because a lot of what we say about the internet could have been said about newspapers in the mid-1800s.
I think that's true. The 60s are kind of a weird era.
Exactly.
And
everything, yeah.
Absolutely. I don't want to idealize them too much, but they did have sort of a centering we didn't have otherwise. There was this weird view for a very long time, and it still persists to a lesser degree, that having instant information, to quote a Marshall McLuhan sort of throw-off line, instant information creates involvement and depth, right? Is that this notion of being able to engage people faster would magically solve all of our problems, right? And my favorite example of that just epically failing is all the people who declared that the telegraph would mean world peace, because now you could talk to the other side immediately. And you sort of ignored the fact that, no, that doesn't get rid of the misunderstanding. You still have the misunderstanding. You still have the disagreement, right? You just now are able to do it faster, right?
That's right. And now that gives us a new thing called spam with the telegraph. But the question I have is my reading of the history of the setting up of democracy in the United States is that there were two types of tyranny that our founders or thinkers were worried about. One was tyranny of the majority. You see that in the Federalist Papers. The second is the tyranny of mediocre. So you see this most in Tocqueville, actually, in his writings. And I'm wondering if now some of our problems really have to do, or potential for problems has to do with the potential for a tyranny of the minority. Basically, you have tremendous people with tremendous resources who can actually play around with the information that is available. And in a situation in which there's so much information, you can take advantage of that and just make your information slightly more accessible, and so you can have people slide over to your side, if you will. You can hold the political system. You can hijack it. Maybe Putin, maybe the Mercers, maybe Koch, whoever your boogeyman you want to have.
Yeah.
I want to get your sense of, do we have a potential issue of, in this information environment, in the technological world we live now, there is more of a problem of tyranny of the minority than there might have been in the past.
I think that's right. I mean, the ability to, I flew here actually on a red eye, not last night, but the night before, from another conference vaguely about these same issues, and dragging in sort of a little bit there. From there was this, this notion of if we actually collectively mobilized and did our stuff, and did all the stuff we know about, we could probably win this particular battle, right? In that we could play the same games that are being played. But so I think yes, and it's an unwillingness to play on some parts. Not that I'm saying that's a bad thing, but that drives it in some ways. But I think there are some, I think the interesting, important questions at the end of the day are, how do we build systems that are just less manipulable in the first place, right? And that's difficult. And I think there clearly is a potential for minorities to use this in very nefarious ways and to build information things that are quite problematic. And I think where you see that sort of the thermostatic-y model or the signal and noise model clearly failing in the contemporary arena is that you can no longer reasonably assume that the people who aren't paying much attention, or the ignorant masses, or whatever are evenly distributed in society. And that is itself kind of problematic, right? That seems something that is perfect grounds for what you're talking about. But I don't know how to exactly deal with that beyond finding some way to get people to defer to some kind of expertise in some environment. And what Norbert was talking about, like, if we're the enemy in academe, and if government is the enemy, and if media is the enemy, I don't know how we find a center that can be believed when it needs to be believed. And that seems to me to be the critical problem.
Yeah, maybe it is, again, what you refer to as the social cleavage rather than partisan. Sort of the sociological answer to studying change in political systems is collective mobilization. But the mystery is how the collective mobilization comes about and who leads it, and how that persons or people in the group gains credibility, and how they present that message.
Well, but I mean, on the other side of that, right, we're seeing a lot of populism right now, and it's not restricted to the right. Right? Now, populism on the right clearly did a little better this last time than populism on the left did. But I would argue that Bernie Sanders is in many ways a product of the same kinds of underlying forces, anti-elitism, and there are structural issues that are real that are being addressed, I think, by a lot of the populism going on, right? There are ways in which the elites have failed to ensure that real incomes increase for people and stuff like that. But in that particular environment, right, the tendency is to throw out sort of expertise across the board, and I don't think that's partisan per se. I think it's so. I'm not sure social movements actually help that much right now, because there's the stuff that people most easily are glomming onto is exactly the stuff that's the anti-institutional problem on a core level, I think. And the solutions people are being pushed to might be better or worse, but I think that's still, yeah.
I just have maybe a noble but a simple question. How much is partisanship wrapped up in generational cohort?
I mean, partisanship varies considerably by generational cohort.
So I'm wondering if, in some sense, the divisiveness dies off because the silent generation will die off. Is that a simplistic analysis?
That is actually, there was a question that was posed to me on Quora this morning. Which is, so if the baby boomers die, will conservatism die? So generationally, you know, there's this,
Right,
that the
exactly.
baby boomers are also as conservative.
Well, they're 50-50. It's
Yeah.
the silent generation are really conservative.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah. So I mean, I think that's in part true. That generational replacement shifts these things in important ways. The data that scares me on that front, though, is that, you know, we haven't instilled the kinds of democratic norms that we need in younger people to ensure that as that generational replacement happens, the stuff that's valued is the process, not the outcome. And I think that really is at the core of what's going wrong right now, is that people are so outcome focused, right, that they're forgetting about the process, right? And I'll give an example that disturbed me not very long ago, where PolitiFact reached out to me on the interpretation of a particular survey result. It was a one-off survey result. It was sort of a mediocre online survey firm, and I didn't know, you know, functionally, you know, the result probably said something about a decent proportion of people. Was it nationally representative? I don't know. But Trump had cited it in a particular tweet, right? And so, yeah, it's the best data out there, right? I don't necessarily think it's that great, but it's the best data out there. That's a reasonable thing to say. But instead of getting evaluated mostly true, it ended up getting evaluated as half true. And I'm not quite sure why, right? And so I think, like, we have a problem where even those forces that are supposed to be really trying to be down the center and even on it are getting a little pushed by the environment and by their context, and that makes it even harder, right? And so I don't know the out to that. Yeah.
How much, I'm just kind of hearing all this, I'm interested, how much do you think, in looking at past work, that we occasionally tend to conflate and it's based on our conversation, we tend to conflate like the extremes with, that most people might be using these technologies and these systems for doing some of the democratic processes and the dialogue that are valuable, but they're getting sucked into, I don't know how to put this, that we hear a lot and see a lot about what's happening at the edges, specifically politically, that these small groups that are galvanizing and taking over some of the mainstream conversations. And then it basically just subverts all the real kind of democratic work. I'm thinking about, like, you know, things like Upward. It's people that are manipulating systems to do things that aren't necessarily, you know, so polarizing, but that underneath a lot of this, but that it's simply, when you said, like, we could be effective at manipulating these systems too. I don't know if we could ever have a less manipulable system or what that would look like, but.
Yeah, I mean, there are things that we all tend to do. Like, the most interesting information in general is the most polarized stuff. Right? So the data out there suggests that, you know, social networks actually aren't showing people only stuff that agrees with them. But to the extent that it's showing you either stuff that's really strongly on your side or really strongly on the other side, the stuff that you end up seeing is like the most easy to discredit, right? And so I think there's a lot of that kind of stuff going on. And so there is some of this stuff toward the center, but it's just not as share interesting in practice, right? And so I think the center gets pushed out, even though, you know. So here's the bit that really has been throwing me off lately, which is if you've got a diverse set of information and you're exposed to a diverse pool of information, right, and you randomly sample from a bigger information environment versus a smaller one, my guess is that if you are coming to summary judgments versus a random broader set of information, those judgments are going to be more polarized functionally. And the reason I think that is because of the weighting problem. Right, that when you see the stuff that you tend to disagree with, you downweight it. But you downweight it both in an online way, as you're evaluating the information immediately, and in a memory-based way, when you sort of collect all the different things that you've seen and try to think at large about what ends up happening. And so one of the areas I think we actually need to do a lot more research that I think we haven't done enough in this particular arena is when you have when you have instead of individual pieces of information and the way people update beliefs off of individual pieces of information, I think we need to focus a lot on how people update beliefs based on collections of information, because I think the distinctions between the two are particularly interesting. And I don't think they're the same. Right? And so that bit is a bit that I think has gotten lost, in part because of these sort of field differences where people are either looking at the system writ large or trying to evaluate particular pieces of information and how they operate. And I think that middle ground is actually a critical area. Yeah?
There's also an additional problem, which is what people do with information, or beliefs they have that are untested. That is, they give credibility to those beliefs, even though they're untested. As a consequence, use those beliefs to judge further beliefs that are coming along. So then not only is there an issue coming, dealing with the information that you get, there's also areas in which you don't have information. Are there any biases that are allowed there? And the answer seems to be quite a lot.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And actually, I've got a whole bunch of information where I ask people to evaluate things that nobody knows the answer to. So I asked people whether the proportion of the federal budget that went to science went up or down during the Obama administration, right? And people don't actually know that answer, right? It happens to have changed by a tiny amount, and I can't even remember which way. But you can see that people's answers to that question, in the basis of zero information whatsoever, is their partisanship, right? So what people are doing is they're imputing the information that they don't have, right, based in part on the evaluation of whether they think it would be a good or bad thing, and the fact that Obama's in the question, right? And so those two things drive people to come to different conclusions about the state of things. Right? And in fact, to repeat those consistently over time, which is really messy and challenging, and I haven't fully figured out how to tease all of that out, right? But so you have these sort of, in the absence of information, when you encounter something, you have, what Converse thought of as non-attitude objects. I actually think of it as non-object attitudes. It's that there's not really a thing that you're evaluating, but there's an attitude direction that you want it to be, and whenever you find an object, you sort of glom onto it, right?